that leads to the question about jobs then. So you pulled up three articles actually, that I thought were fascinating. I don't know if this is intentional, because they sort of painted the job question around AI from three different lenses. So the first
Yes.
is State of Tech Jobs. This is from, I don't know, Lead Code Wizard. I've never heard of this, but basically referring to a study saying that there were 60,000 layoffs and that the industry is basically blaming AI and automation for it. And then there was a separate article about Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, who basically was at a conference and basically was talking about the fact that AI is going to wipe out half of entry level jobs. Um, and sort of what you were talking about, that I can use AI to do all these very simple activities. And then there was this a Nobel laureate from, I forgot where he was from, maybe but a professor from someplace, and basically talking about how hey, you know what, you're both wrong. We're looking at this whole thing all wrong, and we shouldn't be talking about replacing anybody with it. We should be sort of talking about it like Excel, like you just said, and using how we multiply it. And so I think the question is, if we start with this lens, that in order to create competitive value, I have to get really good from an enterprise perspective at how I apply this technology. How does that, or does that, in your mind, flavor this conversation about the jobs and the replacement value that AI brings?
Yeah. So obviously three different topics. Starting with the layoffs, I find it very hard to believe right now that layoffs have anything to do with AI.
Yeah.
That is a red herring right there. These layoffs that are happening right now are really more of a product of the economy 5 years ago, when we were still dealing with zero interest and wild growth and all sorts of tech related economic issues, where we thought every company was going to grow 30% year over year forever. And it turns out that is not actually the case. So I feel like that's the real challenge right now with tech, simply that a lot of companies overhired, especially in the high tech and software worlds, for certain skill sets that are no longer as necessary. And it's unfortunate, but they're all dealing with that glut, and then they're trying to find a nice way to say it. But I don't think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, well, I also think the economic uncertainty that we've had for so far in 2025 is also, so I agree. And I think but nobody wants to say that, and nobody wants to blame over hiring in the past. And so it's um, a convenient option to simply say, oh, it's all about AI. Okay, so I agree with you on that. That said, let's talk about the Anthropic statement, or I guess we probably shouldn't call it Anthropic. We should probably relate. It was him saying it, Dario
Well,
Amodei,
it was Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei, who builds all the stuff, helps build all the stuff for Anthropic, and is a major player in AI. I'm okay with blaming this on Anthropic.
So on the one hand, I agree with you, and I think you made a statement a little bit ago that we shouldn't be really talking about AI replacing jobs. That said, and I mean, I think it's fair to say we're not really there yet. So the companies that have gone out on record saying we're not going to hire, we're reducing our hiring because of that, and I agree with you. That's strategic covering, but I think we are within 12 to 24 months of realistically being able to deploy AI to at least some degree realize this vision, where we can take, because these entry level jobs are often very rote, they're very routine. That's what you do. You take someone who's fresh out of school, who maybe doesn't have the critical thinking skills yet, or the ability, right? That's what you do. You stick them in the job where it's like, this is your job. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it. Rinse and repeat, and you go. Well, those are the sort of jobs that are tailor made for AI. They are fairly deterministic in nature. I can use the AI components to do the elements that create some variance. And so we think of like customer service. You think about the service desk or the help desk within IT. You think about um, you junior level coders, right? All of these sorts of activities, that all the use cases that we are seeing AI be applied to. It is not a huge stretch to imagine that in the relative near term that this is a true statement. Whether it's half or not, we can debate, but that there's at least some impact on it. And so the question is this catastrophic, or does that simply, like, does this mean that those, therefore, half of new college graduates aren't going to be able to find a job because there's no place for them to go? Or does this simply mean that that starting job isn't this routine, rote, boring job, and instead we're going to put them to use in a way that takes more advantage of their education and background? I mean, what that's where I took this and said, is this really all that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of trade-offs and issues here. First, the idea of all of these entry-level white-collar jobs disappearing in 12 to 24 months. Right now the technology is still, I would say, one step away from quite getting there. We have deep research and document creating capabilities from, we just talked about Perplexity doing it. There's also companies like Manus, and all of the strong big LLMs, are foundational LLMs, are going in this direction as well. But I guess it's not too hard to believe that in 2 years we're going to have some way to be able to orchestrate all of those deeper research capabilities and be able to sequence them in a way that imitates a work day, or works 24 hours a day on a series of sequenced jobs and capabilities. Um, and the problem is, frankly, that tool, when it comes out into play, will be smarter at doing a first year entry level job than any college graduate. That's just the honest truth, because it will be designed to do that. I still think that, say, a third or fourth year employee, or somebody with 5 years experience, will have an advantage over these tools and will be able to help orchestrate these tools. But now we run into this problem of trying to figure out, how do we train college students, or high school students for that matter, to go into the workplace and to be able to understand the work job enough to be able to manage these tools? Because it's that paradox. The person will never be as good as the first year tool, the introductory AI tool. It's going to, somebody with 5 years experience will know far more than the AI tool, because the AI tool doesn't know how to reason in a human fashion at the end of the day. So it's limited in how much it can reason. So, but we have to bridge that gap.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole how do you get to 5 years if there's no entry level? And
Right.
so it means redefining what entry level is. And does that mean we stair step? And that means the entry level is this 5 year position. And what does that translate to? And I also I question it a little bit because I don't know that simply having expertise or even quote unquote reasoning capabilities are enough, because the deterministic else aspects of it, the tools are just going to keep getting better. And
Mhm.
so I had it's funny because I hadn't thought about this, but right before the pandemic, I was doing a lot more speaking, and I sort of had a keynote circuit. And so I had to set a bunch of canned keynotes. And I'd actually coined the term the new human age. And
Mhm.
the term was basically intended to imply that as we are entering this world of AI, and this was pre, ChatGPT and all that, but that in that world where AI and technology was automating everything we could reduce to an algorithm, that the true value for humans was in fact being human, was being able
Mhm.
to be empathetic and to have a conversation and being able to relate to somebody. And I think those are all still true, because while AI will replicate, today is far more capable of replicating an empathetic type conversation than anything I could have imagined even 5 years ago. Um, Unless I'm going to lie to the person on the other end of the line or screen, it will fail at being truly empathetic, because we empathy requires us to be able to put someone into other shoes, and an AI can never, in fact, do that. It can only sound empathetic, and it can only
Mhm.
convey the idea, but it can't actually create empathy, because we can't be empathetic to a non-human being. At least I don't think. And so to me, my premise has been, if you want to have job security, focus on the things that AI and technology are never going to be able to do, like those human relationships. But that's not about expertise. That's not about domain knowledge per se. And so that sort of begs the question: what does that avenue look like? And in fact, are there enough of those jobs, right, that where there's that angle? And I think it's a fascinating question when I looked at this, because if I'm being honest, my first gut reaction when I read the quote was to dismiss it out of hand. It's like, no more of this hand waving from an AI guy. But the more I thought about it, the more I can sort of buy into the concept that whatever the actual number is, that there's going to be a significant impact, and then B, left with a quandary about, well, what do you do with that then? How do you manage that? And
Yeah, I think we have this bigger existential problem that whether this is in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, I do think we're going to get to a point where half of all tech jobs will be taken over by AI. We are going to get there. It's just a matter of 2 years versus 10 years. I don't think it's even 2 years versus 20 years. I think within the next decade, we will get there. And then we will start having this bigger problem of what happens when you wipe out this entire swath of white collar above average income jobs in an economy. And
yeah,
like you can't just have 10% that extra 10% unemployed, and then we have all sorts of different options, and most of them are not considered, call it American or democratic, things like re-education.
yeah, no, I
Or
think
universal
it
basic income, like which is not traditionally considered an American free market goal.
Yeah, well, if you remember during the last presidential cycle, Andrew Yang ran on this whole premise, right? He is someone that has had a long history, and the fact that we were coming. And what's interesting is people like Elon Musk were actually advocating for it not very long ago, and there had been this whole upswell that, ironically, before all of this became much more of a reality, there was this upswell that, hey, this was going to be impactful and that we needed to address it, and it's sort of fallen away. And it's ironic because we're now at a point where this is starting to become a much closer degree of reality. And yet, I think this is the part I guess I agree. Agree with. I mean, my name's Amadi. How do you say Amadi? How do you say his name?
Amodei.
Amodei. um, where I think I agree with him in that his point of making the statement in his estimation, as he said it, was to sort of make a wake up call that nobody's paying attention, that we're ignoring this fact. And I think in that regard, I agree with him that we don't, to your point, we don't know the timing. I don't know that we know the full scope, but I think we can all agree that the writing's on the wall, that there's going to be an impact. And as employers, as a CIO or as an enterprise, you owe it to yourself to be very diligent about this and to not just sort of ride this wave, but to look at it from both perspectives or from multiple perspectives, right? One, how do you actually use it to create sustainable competitive advantage first and foremost, because that's your fiduciary mandate. But then secondly, what does that do to your staffing plans? What does that do to your employee retraining programs? How do you reallocate that staff, and how do you in fact use that to create competitive advantage? Can you get your staff to do more? Can they be more productive? Can they use this technology to create advantage? And this is what I think where the last one is, and I actually don't find them mutually exclusive. But this gentleman, Daron, I'm not even going to try, Acemoglu.
Acemoglu, yes. MIT Nobel Laureate in economics last year. Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. So, he's sort of making the case that, hey, it shouldn't be about replacement, it's about augmentation. We've heard this case before, and he cites a bunch of numbers. And I agree with it, but I also think that these aren't at counterpoints. I think these are both going to be true. And I think the big challenge if you're a CIO is, how do you reconcile this? How do you figure out what that looks like?
Yeah, and what one thing I found interesting about Acemoglu's findings is he crunched the numbers like a macroeconomist would, and I will assume that being both an MIT tenured professor and a Nobel Prize winner, he has some idea of how to do this. And he came to the back of the napkin conclusion that only about 5% of jobs would truly be affected, and there would be only a marginal increase in global GDP as a result, which that can still be a big windfall for a lot of people, because if you're talking about $100 trillion, even a 1% increase, that's $1 trillion bucket to to work with, and that will make plenty of people rich. But it might not necessarily be the 50% number or 20% number that is being thrown out by more optimistic perspectives. Like I think I saw either an Accenture or McKinsey type report that talked about 5 to 7% increase in global GDP in the near future due to AI. And I think that seems unusually, unbelievably optimistic to me.
Well, and let's not lose sight of the fact that many of the people that are making these very optimistic statements are also selling the technology in one
Mhm.
form or another, right? So
Well, it's
that's
kind of
it's
odd though, because we're both kind of selling the technology as well, and yet we're here sounding the alarm a
we're
bit.
analysts at heart. We can't help ourselves but be natural skeptics, and that's what we do. But the what I think is interesting about it is what I found interesting in this particular. So this is from an MIT Technology Review article. Is that it sort of backed up or was in alignment, and maybe intentionally because the other ones were also MIT
Mhm.
Sloan, with this idea that it's not going to have a major impact because, in fact, it's normalizing, right? Everyone has access to it, so you're not going to see this great rush in GDP necessarily because it's normalizing. But I do think it is interesting as well that we've been seeing more and more of this data that is sort of saying, hey, you're not going to see this massive explosion in productivity. You're not going to see this massive explosion in like employment replacement driving that productivity, and therefore, are all these massive investments worthwhile? Does it make sense to do this? But to your point, when you're talking at this scale, it doesn't take that much of a percentage increase to actually generate enough money to make it worthwhile. So I think that's an interesting question. But I think, to me, that getting all the way down to the pragmaticism of this, if you're a CIO and you take all of this and we can sort of talk ourselves into circles here where we talked about how it doesn't create competitive advantage and yet we're going to replace all these jobs and it doesn't really create productivity. There's massive productivity boost, but hey, we're still talking that's real dollars that could be super impactful, right? And you can be left here scratching your head and it's like, well, what the heck do you do?